All right. And we are joined by our procurement assistant, Devin Abraham, who is going to be assisting with capturing any questions that you may have. And like I said, again, there will be an FAQ document that's added to the PhilaWorks procurement website at the end of this week with the questions that you may have. Again, for those of you who I've not met yet or are just joining on to the call now, my name is Marcus Hall. I'm Director for Workforce Operations for PhilaWorks. I'd like to obviously be able to welcome everyone to this bidders conference to discuss the Specialized Employment and Training Services for Vulnerable Communities, RFP. And without further ado, let's kick it off. So just before we jump into the specifics for the RFP, I just want to please note that this presentation is broken down into sections to allow for questions. For any question that I may not be able to address, please know that we will be writing down all the questions and obviously make sure that we're able to address it in the FAQ document that will be posted on our website. And then we will also have time for Q&A at the end of each section. So if you do have questions, like while we're going through the content, feel free to use the chat box to put in your questions. But like I said, at the end of each section, we will have time for question and answer. All right, so for those who may be unfamiliar with PA Career Link and also for PhilaWorks functional relationship, we have this incredibly packed slide for you to reference. So I'll just kind of like summarize it as best as possible. So a ton of information here, but generally this is showing that the flow of funding that really starts from two main federal agencies, the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of Human Services. Funds from WIOA, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, and Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, flow to PhilaWorks, which is the local workforce development board for Philadelphia County, which is then distributed to the system in the form of our PA Career Link Center Network, our youth systems, and specialized projects such as apprenticeship PHL, industry partnerships, and et cetera. So when we're thinking about this particular initiative, this initiative is funded directly from the U.S. Department of Labor using WIOA funds, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move further along within the process. But this is just to show you kind of like the flow of where the money kind of originates from and how it then gets directed down to the local level. Our PhilaWorks contracts with 4 providers to oversee our one-stop centers, which are located in North Philly, Northwest Philly, Suburban Station, as well as West Philly. We also contract with a provider to provide system-wide services to bring Career Link resources to communities that may have a hard time coming to our integrated centers. PhilaWorks has implemented an integrated model for employment support services for customers that include job placement, retention services, supportive services, in addition to vocational skills training opportunities. And on any given year, generally, our PA Career Link Center serves approximately 40,000 to 50,000 Philadelphia residents seeking to gain skills to be able to thrive in the workforce. Generally, there are 3 ways for customers to get connected to any of our PA Career Link locations. So recipients of TANF or SNAP are referred to their closest Career Link location by their district county assistance office. Recipients of unemployment compensation may have their job search requirements that will require them to register with a PA Career Link. And we also receive a significant number of customers who walk in with an interest in employment or training opportunities, job readiness skills workshops, and obviously we'll be able to service obviously all of our customers depending on where they are within their employment cycle. As many of you are aware, connecting customers with employment and training opportunities requires a significant amount of support from our community of service staff members. So each Career Link location assists with individualized career counseling and goal setting. We coordinate with digital literacy and adult education providers, have available funding for free or subsidized approved training programs, and among other services that leads to obviously we also include a robust number of workshops for our customers to be able to take advantage of. But this ultimately does lead into the purpose of this RFP. We have worked and continue to work to create a system where customers can come in to any center and receive, just one person in the waiting room, excuse me, and receive a similar experience as possible. But we do recognize, acknowledge the fact that often there are customers that face significant circumstances that may introduce either a potential barrier or require a different path. So this is to lend or to be able to amplify the expertise of those that are in the room right now, working with very specific populations to be able to better serve specific communities. So before we get into the specifics around the RFP, are there any specific questions about the Career Link centers, the network itself, the system, anything of the like? I know there were questions that were submitted beforehand, and we tried to address them in later portions of the presentation, but are there any questions about any of the material that's been presented thus far?
I have a question. This is American Advanced Institute of Technology, Director of Education, Irene Cluen. Probably it is related to what you said. I know there are no stupid questions. So if we are already have a trade agreement with the Career Link, are we good for this grant? Because there was in the application a sentence saying that saying something that you cannot be related to Career Link.
So I think
programs proposed should operate primarily outside of the PA Career Link Philadelphia centers. What does that mean?
Yes.
Does that mean location or?
Yes, that means the actual physical location where services are being provided. If you currently have a contract with PhilaWorks or PA Career Link, then that does not exclude you from applying for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. Are there any other questions about any of the content before we move on to some of the specifics about this RFP? All right, so just moving on a little bit here. So PhilaWorks obviously is very excited to announce the release of the Specialized Employment and Training Services for Vulnerable Communities funding opportunity, which is designed to support programs and organizations that facilitate training and employment programs for specific vulnerable populations. This is an opportunity to learn from organizations that do this work every day, an opportunity to offer an opportunity to expand the scale of impact. We will discuss in a few minutes kind of like the populations that we would like to concentrate or focus our efforts on in this RFP. But before doing so, I'd just like to emphasize the desire for applied organizations to meet the following criteria. Number one, to have a proven track record for recruiting populations that you have decided to focus on as part of this, as part of your application. Meaning that if any applicant has a proven track record of, let's say, recruiting immigrants, for instance, but submits an application focused on returning citizens or justice impacted individuals, this may be obviously difficult to prove, but it may require additional collaboration or partnership with other agencies as part of their application. Applicants will also need to outline a clear plan and desired supports for retaining participants. Clear readiness activities that are tied to industries and or professions with family sustaining wage opportunities. Stronger applicants will have opportunities tied to our recovery occupations that we will discuss in the next few slides. The emphasis for this is employment. So any applicant that leads into credential attainment should ultimately have employment as the end result for participants. Lastly, applicants must show what supports and wraparound services will be available to participants in this program. And so here are the specified populations that we've identified as the focus for this RFP. Job search, barrier reduction, case management, and any other related activities should be specialized to work directly with at least one of the identified groups. So when we say older workers, we're talking about a person that's 55 years of age or older looking to gain full-time employment. Justice involved individuals, a person who either has been subject to any stage of the criminal justice system or requires assistance in overcoming artificial barriers to employment resulting from the record of arrest or conviction. A person's experiencing homelessness, persons recovering from substance abuse, immigrants, refugees, or foreign born. persons with disabilities, that's a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the person's major life activities, as well as single parent, a person who is single, separated, divorced, or widowed, and has primary responsibility for one or more dependent children under 18, or is currently pregnant. This program is intended to recruit single parents. This program is not intended, to recruit single parents that qualify for TANF or SNAP. Those obviously programs will be, we have obviously a large number of programs right now that is focused on TANF and SNAP. So we will be directing participants or programs to that funding source with those specific programs. So that should not be a priority or an identified target audience as part of the application for this particular initiative. And obviously, we also mentioned LGBTQ plus workers, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning or any other diverse identity. Now, PhilaWorks obviously does recognize that we are not including every possible community of need within this RFP. Much of the decision to identify the groups that are represented here came from our own internal research and data concerning our outcomes for specific groups. Initiatives that may currently exist, internal or external to PhilaWorks, and general demographics of the city at large and the communities that are underserved by our system. Right. So we know that obviously beforehand, this is not for us to say that these are the only groups that need assistance. This is just an opportunity for us to be able to identify based on our internal research and based on programs that we know are available, for instance, for youth aged like 12 to 24 or any other population, that there is, this is not an attempt for us to say that this is the only community that is in need of services. These are just the communities that we've identified as part of this specific initiative. So as part of federal regulation, we must clearly state that the specialized employment and training services for disadvantaged, for vulnerable communities, I should say vulnerable, RFP is supported by funds from the U.S. Department of Labor, a total range of $1 million to $1.5 million, or 100% of the specialized employment for training services for vulnerable communities. Request for proposal is financed through with federal funds. And obviously, like I mentioned before, this is entirely through the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA funds. And I will also like to just emphasize the reason why we wanted to put this here and not a little bit further in the presentations, because for those who are either unfamiliar with the restrictions as it pertains to WIOA funds, it'll be good for you to be able to recognize some of the limitations that does exist for WIOA funds. So when we say possible restrictions, we know that as a subcontractor awardee, which would the awardee or awardees in this particular situation will become a subcontractor with PhilaWorks, you will be expected to abide by all WIOA regulations and restrictions for funding usage. So that includes like not all supportive services will be allowed under WIOA. And so we'll provide you with a list of the supportive services that would not be included or not be allowed as part of WIOA funding. So for example, any expenses that occur prior to enrollment or after participation in a WIOA program are not allowed for this particular funding stream. Incentives are extremely restricted when it comes to WIOA funding. So membership fees, internet, phone service, would just be examples of distributions that would not be allowed as part of WIOA funding. And if there is a mention of incentives or supportive services that may be disallowed under WIOA funds that's included within your application, it'll just be good for you to be able to reference the use of alternative funds, unrestricted funds, to be able to obviously provide those incentives or those supportive services. Also, just spending a little bit more time in terms of like the key provisions and performance requirements for WIOA Title I and dislocated services. They're measured in primarily 3 different ways, by credential attainment, employment rate after exit, and then measurable skill gain. So when we say credential attainment, we're just talking about the percentage of participants enrolled in an education or training program who attain an industry recognized credential or secondary school diploma or its recognized equivalent. Employment rate, that's included second and fourth quarter after exit, since this is a 6 to 12 month commitment. Generally, like 2 quarters after exit will probably be the most readily available data, especially for those who are obviously starting the program in the initial stages. And then for measurable skill gain, this will be something that will be defined when we have negotiation with the awardees as to how this will be defined from a documented academic, technical, occupational standpoint, employment goal. So this is a measure that we will have more flexibility to be able to define as part of this specific initiative. So PhilaWorks will be partnering with obviously the awardees to appropriately document and communicate measurable skill gains in accordance with our local policies and procedures. So we'll talk a little bit more. My next slide here kind of like has a little bit of some examples of some additional performance measures that we internally have come up with to be able to help identify performance measures that may lead into credential attainment or measurable skill gain. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we go into some of the more specifics about the application itself. But some performance measures that we will be ultimately could introduce as part of this initiative would be maybe training and education completion rate, a barrier removal rate. So how many of the participants are identifying transportation as a barrier, and then ultimately that barrier is being alleviated through supportive services. An individualized employment plan objective achievement rate. So that means that ultimately someone comes in, they're saying that they want to get their phlebotomy, they want to move into the phlebotomy, for example, industry, and they actually obviously continue to move forward to that path. They may obviously receive their credential, receive their employment placement. They start with recognizing an industry and ultimately do end up within that industry. Employment goal achievement rate and median wage for customers entering employment. These are just examples of performance measures that we may want to think about when we enter into those actual scope of service with the awarded vendor or vendors or providers. So just as an example, not necessarily saying that these will be included within the actual proposal. And I think the last thing here before we open up to some questions, I mentioned before about recovery occupations. So strong applications obviously will be tied to industries that are recognized as part of our recovery occupations initiative. For those who are unaware, this came from an internal data review. Our data team spent a significant amount of time reviewing the high priority occupations list and determined and created this list of recovery occupations that had more granular type of criteria that I think were specific to the Philadelphia region. So at a more detailed level, we use several criteria to identify recovery occupations. So our data team reviewed labor data from the past 10 years, determined what occupations have and will continue to experience consistent growth in the future. Identified occupations with little risk of automation, requires less than a bachelor's degree. We know a lot of our customers may have may not have completed a bachelor's degree yet, so we didn't want to. So we wanted to find jobs that are accessible to most residents of Philadelphia. And obviously, have a median wage of $15 an hour, and we're also minimally factored by COVID-19. So before we move on to eligibility requirements, I want to stop here to see if there are any questions. I know there's probably a lot of information. Again, this is recorded. But if there are any questions, I can feel free to be able to try to address those now.
Hi, Marcus.
Good morning.
Oh, I'm sorry, Irene, you had your hand up.
No, go ahead.
I was just wondering, could somebody put a link for that planning guide in the chat, please?
Yep. So I will put it in the chat. Devin, I'm not sure if you have access to it, you can put it in the chat, but this will also be sent out to all the participants as part of this call. So you'll get the guide in your email, and then it'll also be posted on the procurement website as well.
I don't think I have the link at the moment.
Okay. I'll just bring it up.
Good afternoon, Marcus. Tori Garvin. I'm the Director of Workforce Development here
Hey,
at
good afternoon.
Southwest CDC. Quick question for you. If we're currently providing different services to more than one of the listed targeted populations, are we required to only identify one, or are we allowed to identify multiple targets, population listed for our proposal?
You are allowed to mention as many of the identified populations as you can, as per the focus of your program. So there's no limitation as long as you're able to recognize one of them. I will also say that there was a question that was posed in terms of if there's a program that that just maybe not necessarily by focus, but kind of like by happenstance, you have obviously, like, you know, let's say that you have a program that just naturally has a significant number of single parents, even though you have not necessarily marketed or put it in outreach that is designed for single parents. So in that particular instance, you would just need to be able, in the structure for your application, you would need to probably refine or state what specific workforce solutions you have embedded into your program that allows for single parents to be successful within the program. You don't necessarily have to say, like, this is project XYZ for single parents, but you need to be able to include within your proposal why this specific program is meeting the needs of this specific population. Now,
Thank you very much.
And I will say that if that program serves multiple communities, that's even better. I mean, obviously, we don't have all the money in the world, and we're trying to spread it as much as possible to influence and to learn about how we can better serve multiple different communities and not necessarily just kind of like one of those like 8 buckets.
Thank you again.
Irene?
And in relation to the question that was just asked, we have programming courses and the admission requirement doesn't have the bachelor degree, so it pretty much targets every community that has an inkling to study programming, and we start from the scratch. So we can indicate all the communities that you mentioned. So is that allowed?
So yeah, so I mean, ultimately it is your it is completely up to you in terms of identifying which groups is specifically assisted, I guess, primarily as part of your program. I will probably say that if you're ultimately having a proposal that is, we're looking for very specific workforce solutions for specific populations. I think that ultimately what we have noticed is that we have tried, as part of our integrated center model, to create an experience where anyone, whether it be youth or LGBTQ, can come into the center and ultimately have a similar experience. Mm-hmm. What we have learned is that that's not necessarily happening. There is maybe like there's a barrier that we're not recognizing. There is a step that we're not seeing. And it requires a very specific type of mediation or infusion of a specific type of additional supports. So when we're looking at, like, we're reviewing proposals, I will say that, like, it will be difficult. I don't like, not impossible, but I believe it will be difficult to have one program that literally just says that, like, this is the program that ultimately can serve all these different populations. And so all I will say is ultimately we are looking for very specific examples or track record as to what has uniquely worked for someone that might have just returned home from incarceration, or like someone who just obviously came, obviously just came to the United States from who was, like, obviously foreign born. So not saying obviously, like, that's going to be at a disadvantage or anything, but we are looking for workforce solutions for programs that have specific measures and steps catered towards certain populations.
And one other little questions. What is meant by industry recognized credentials?
Yeah, so that's just essentially when we're thinking about like the ability for someone to move into an industry or profession. So you'll see as part of the recovery occupations, we have included there like the credential that would be needed, certification or credential that would be needed to actually move in and qualify for a certain industry or a certain profession. And so when we talk about ultimately like what will ultimately be required, what licenses or certification will be required to move into a specific industry or a specific profession.
Okay, so if we award diplomas that are authorized by Pennsylvania Department of Education, will that suffice to be called recognized credential?
Yes, as part of like the credential attainment definition, yes, that would be included.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course.
Hi, Marcus. Can I go next?
Of course.
So I noticed that the contracts will vary between 6 and 12 months. Is there a minimum, I guess, proposed amount of customers and job seekers that each contractor or subcontractor should propose and, in their proposal?
So there is no minimum. I think part of what we're really looking from a data standpoint is when we're comparing our per pupil cost for like across the entire system, and we see like effective programs, how do we compare that with some of our other initiatives, right? So we have a certain amount of per pupil funding that we use for our youth systems, that we use for each of our customers that are coming into our integrated centers. If you have a proposal with a certain number of participants with a certain number, and obviously like the outcomes from that are like immaculate, then that gives us a good sense as to how many supports and how much effort, how much resources we need to be able to put in if we're going to obviously have a level of impact for certain populations. So to answer your question, no, there is no minimum.
Okay.
But obviously we would like to have as much impact as possible.
And to piggyback off of the per participant requirement, is there a per participant cost that you guys are looking for, or that it should fall in? Is there a range that it should fall in?
No, we haven't. Yeah, we haven't determined a range, and we don't want to put that level of restriction because again, that would make the assumption that we ultimately know what it looks like, and we want to be able to give complete flexibility for applicants to tell us what that should be.
Okay, thank you. Of
course. And Daniel, I'm still looking for getting that link, so I would definitely make sure you'll have that before we leave here today.
I think it's in here, Marcus.
Oh, perfect. All right.
I think Rochelle dropped it in here. Thank you, Rochelle.
Thank you for sharing. All right, any other questions? I'll just looking at the chat box too. All right, and so just looking at the chat box, apologies for missing a few questions here. So yes. So could you comment on the fact that clients may exist at the intersection of these focus areas? For example, an immigrant can also be experiencing homelessness as well as a single parent. How do we draw the line? Just a few people in the waiting room. So yeah, so obviously we do recognize that there's there's ultimately going to be customers that sit and rest or are influenced by like multiple different groups. I think what we are asking for you to do is to have a program that provides a workforce solutions strategy for at least one of those specific areas. So you may have obviously an immigrant that's experiencing like homelessness, experiencing obviously being like a single parent. But what we're looking for is if you want to have a proposal that addresses all of those potential barriers, then that is ultimately what feel free to be able to submit an application for that. But we are specifically asking for applicants to at least be able to identify a program that serves at least one of those areas. And so if there are obviously there are going to be influencers, but and the more I think when the question is how do we draw the line? Again, we don't want to put necessarily those restrictions or those limitations on your proposal. We want to learn from the experiences that you've had. And so if you experience kind of like, if you have a specific program that has that dynamic, then how have you worked through it? And to be able to kind of like share and allow us to be able to assist with that level of impact. It's not really it's not a, hard and fast rule as to like, no, you only have to, like, you have to have like a certain population that only are sitting within one potential barrier or one potential bucket. We just know that that's not necessarily the case, but we are relying on the expertise, on your expertise, to ultimately be able to help us inform as to how best to serve populations that may sit in multiple of these different priority buckets. If an agency currently provides services to more than one target populations, are they required to identify only one of the target populations for the RFP? No, that is not a requirement. You can identify as many of the target populations as you wish. How many subcontracts do you expect to award? And how many do you expect to be served by each contractor? So we will get into this a little bit later when we talk about the actual eligibility and the application process. Thank you, Rochelle, for the link. Can you please clarify, are applicants acting as connectors to training services or providers of the training services? So I do want to be able to differentiate, and this is one thing we're going to talk about a little bit later. This is not an application for a vocational skills training opportunity. We have a procurement process for VSTs. We have a procurement process for training services. The intention of this is employment placement. If training and credentialing is ultimately the conduit or the connector that leads into employment, then that is perfectly fine. But this is not designed to be a training program with the intention of ending with a certification or a credential. Obviously, that can be a major point of it, but ultimately the proposals will be valued based on the goal of having each of the participants end with employment. What supportive services other than transportation may be funded through one of the proposals? So following up with this, I know there's some questions about the Appendix A that was referenced in the proposal. That will give you a list of all the supportive services that are available through WIOA funds. So you'll have all that information. We also help young teenagers that just graduated high school. Would there be a different funding source? That will be a different funding source. We do have WIOA and TANF youth funds that we are specifically using for to assist young teenagers, specifically like 12 to 24 qualify for that funding stream. And could you clarify the language on page 3 of the RFP under the credential achievement section that excludes on-the-job training? Okay, I think we're going to be talking about that a little bit later when we go into a little bit more about the performance measures. So any other questions or any clarifications from anything that was said before we move into the eligibility requirements? All right, perfect. All right, so let's spend some time kind of like addressing some eligibility and application requirements. So eligible applicant organizations include any for-profit, nonprofit, education institution, or government entity. Organizations, as I mentioned before, that already have a contract with PhilaWorks are not excluded from applying for this opportunity. Applicants are required to submit audited financial statements with a heavy preference for financials that are externally audited. So again, that's just like mentioning that last part, like we will be requesting audited financial statements. And like I said, with a heavy preference on those financials being externally audited. Strong applicant organizations, as mentioned before, will show a robust, extensive experience, infrastructure, staff capacity, and content expertise in their proposals. A demonstrated history of successful recruitment and continued retention with the priority focus on employment. I like I mentioned before, I continue to emphasize that this is not intended to be another to be a vocational skills training opportunity. There was a separate procurement for new or recurring VSTs. This is intended to contract with providers that have a model for workforce solutions for specified populations that prepare and subsequently connect them to employment opportunities. And the training component, like I mentioned before, can be embedded in the service offerings, but we are looking for programming to be driven to a goal of employment, not necessarily not necessarily just simply credential attainment. And just last thing here, we talk about the familiarization with the PA Career Link system and the resources that are available. When we talk about recruitment for this particular program, you can obviously be able to work with any of our Career Link locations to be able to use any of our centers for additional recruitment activities. And explaining a little bit more about those measurable engagement metrics. So what this means is that I'll spend, just like I said, spending a little bit more time, like performance metrics for program completion will be informed by the plan and the scope of service that we ultimately do work out with our awardee or awardees. This is just like an example of quantifiable metrics that that may include, but are not limited to. So when we think about something like a training and education completion rate, so those are like customers who successfully complete a training or education services earn higher wages than customers who don't necessarily don't successfully complete. So this measure prioritizes helping customers stay in training through completion. When we think about, I mentioned before, the IEP or individualized employment plan achievement rate. So that's like the stepping stones on the way to achieving employment. Another real-time progress measure that focuses on incremental gains during a customer's journey. So these are, like I said, I will provide you with a full list of some examples of performance measures that are included within a WIOA program elements. And these will be helpful just to be able to include as part of your proposal. How are you going to be defining success, and how will you be tracking and measuring over the course of a participant's participation in your program? How will you ultimately be measuring that is what we would like to be able to see as part of your proposal. I think this is the last slide for this particular section before we move into the budget information and payment structure. So was there any questions about, I know this quick information, but any questions about here? Anthony?
Yes, our fiscal sponsors allowed. We are a nonprofit and we do have a fiscal sponsor.
So speak more about that. Are they allowed to apply on behalf?
Yeah, so they would oversee our fiscal activity and our reporting to PhilaWorks.
So yes, that is not, it's not an exclusion. It would just have to be obviously
laid out
quite extensively
Yep.
into like their role, and obviously with their role in relation to programmatic elements.
Right. Oh, okay. So like the decision-making capacity. Yeah,
Yes.
it wouldn't be programmatic.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, I got it. Thank you.
Of course.
Have a question.
Uh-huh.
One of the requirements of the application is audited financials, as you mentioned.
Mhm.
Now, we have delivered for 15 years, we have delivered these programs for the CareerLink people and for private students with practically 99% of job placement. However, we are a small school. The program is very successful. We're a small school with not a very big profit. So putting in the application, even before getting the grant, would put us out for this audited financial out for $10,000 to $20,000. So is there any chance that we can just submit the profit and loss that shows our financial statement, or it does have to be audited because it puts us out of the picture completely?
So
The audited ordering audited financials is very expensive. We have done that, and it's.
yeah. So what I was saying, when we mentioned before, it's heavily that our heavy preference is our externally audited financials. We have received in the past financials that internally were audited, that they have just done an ongoing assessment of their profit and loss statements. What I will ask, or what I will suggest, is to submit all the financials, like submit whatever financial reports that you have. I saw that there's a question, is the older set of audited financials okay? It's obviously ideally we would like the most recent audited financial statements. It depends, like Paul, how far back those financials go. But to Irene and Paul, anyone else's question pertaining to this, what I will suggest is just to submit whatever audited materials you have, if they're not externally audited financials. And then our finance team, which is a separate finance panel, reviews each of the applications. They will then follow up with some additional questions or may need for either clarification or may ask for you to produce like an additional document that you may have. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that you shouldn't think about it as something that would necessarily exclude you from it. Again, it is a heavy preference. Submit what you have, and then ultimately, as we move forward with the selection process, if we need more information, we'll absolutely obviously be able to reach out to you, and our finance team will ask for more information.
And is it a requirement for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years?
Ideally, we would like to have at least 3 years.
Okay.
Ideally,
Mhm. Thank you.
of course. Any other questions pertaining to that section? All right. All right, so next section is our budget information and payment structure. So we're going to focus a little bit more on obviously this section. Proposed budgets must be entered in the RFP's provided budget sheet. So all of you should have access to that. I believe it was uploaded as a fillable form, so you should be able to just type directly into that document. I will say and emphasize the payment structure for all awarded funds. It's a cost reimbursement structure. So this exacerbates the need for candidates to be in good financial standing, which includes enough cash on hand to kick off activities, since there are no startup funds that are allowed as part of WIOA, funding. Funding for this project is contingent upon the availability of funds. So what we mean here is that we've identified, multiple communities of focus. So this funding may be awarded to multiple providers depending on the strength of the application, the amount that's requested, and ultimately that's then awarded, and then remaining applications to be considered. So all the applications will be scored, and then based on the applications that receive the highest score and then the requested amount, we will determine what the awarded amount would be, and then that will obviously be deducted from the portion of all the funds that are available, and then we would then consider the next application that's the next highest, and then obviously we will just continue with that process until we've exhausted pretty much all the funds that are available. Which also ultimately means this may suggest that greater collaboration with similar organizations that may serve another identified population might be a good strategy for this. Following proposal determinations, a modified or more detailed budget may be requested, and providers must seek approval from PhilaWorks for costs associated with the contract that's not identified as part of the budget. And I will also say that providers will also be required to adhere to determined monthly reporting for all approved costs. And just included here was just like just a picture format of the budget. Again, this was included as part of the RFP materials that were downloaded from the procurement site. If there were any issues in terms of downloading it or not opening the file, please let me know immediately and I can be able to send it to you directly. As a side note, please just make sure that your numbers add up. The numbers that are reflected on the budget sheet should match the explanation and the figures specified in the budget narrative. The last thing any of us want is to disqualify a candidate or not consider a candidate because like a number was transposed or something like that. So just double check to just ensure that ultimately the numbers that are reflected as part of your line item budget here matches what is included on the budget narrative, the further explanation of the identified expenses. We have had a number of situations in which we received great proposals, but then ultimately we had to do a lot of back and forth because the numbers that were included as part of this budget did not reflect the numbers that were reported as part of the budget narrative. Meredith, I see that you have a question. Can proposal budgets include subcontracted partners to deliver specific services within a project? If so, where would we note that in the budget template? So yes, that is the case. And I will need to let me follow up with you specifically, everyone, obviously Meredith, in terms of our finance team as to where they would like that, where they would like that to go. And I'll definitely include that as part of like our RFP follow-up. But that's a great question. Yep. All right. And any questions, any additional questions in terms of the budget submission or the budget form? All right, I think we are entering the last section here. So thank you all for hanging on. So we obviously released this RFP March 31st. Today is our bidders conference. The FAQ document will be posted on the procurement website this Friday. And the deadline for all proposals will be May 1st. That is a Monday at 5 o'clock. And we will have the goal of making the award determinations on May 25th. And I know there was a little bit of confusion in terms of the actual start date that was included in the proposal, but the start date is going to be July 31st is the intended start date as part of this particular program. Proposals must be submitted by email to Workforce Operations RFP at PhilaWorks.org, again, by Monday, May 1st. Please include in the subject line, Specialized Employment and Training Services RFP. Same type of format as our other RFPs. If you've applied for funding before, single-sided, single-spaced, 1-inch margins with nothing smaller than 12-point font. We're trying to be nice to our reviewers. And then I know this is also an area of a few questions in terms of the open-ended questions for questions 11 through 15. There is a 500-word limit for those questions. Okay, so you'll see on the application, you'll see those open-ended questions. Please use obviously a 500-word limit and must meet all the page limit requirements. And if you can include just all your materials in one PDF document comprising all components and any attachments, and just submit that one document, that PDF document, to the Workforce Operations RFP at PhilaWorks.org email address, just one document. Once again, obviously, like this is the email. Q&As will be posted on the procurement website by no later than this Friday. You can obviously feel free to follow us on our social media platforms. Again, questions will be allowed to be submitted up until this Friday. So if there are any questions that you may have after this call that you obviously just want to follow up with, you can obviously be able to email our Workforce Operations RFP at PhilaWorks.org email address with any of those questions, and we will include it as part of the FAQ document that will be included on the website on Friday. And with that, we'll see if there are any additional lingering questions, and I can be able to try to address them now, and then we all can have a great day.
I have one last question. There is a narration that says that PhilaWorks provide connection between the job seekers and us providers. How is that done?
So you're talking about within the RFP document?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
PhilaWorks provide connection between the job seekers and us and the training providers.
So yeah, that can look multiple different ways. So I just need to be able to reference exactly what section you're referring to. That could be like the actual centers. That could be what we call system.
No, that's somewhere in the beginning. I don't remember where, but somewhere in the beginning of the description of the proposal.
Okay. Let me go back into that section. I just don't want to make sure I'm like giving you the wrong information, and then I'll make sure to include in the FAQs just like a further explanation of that particular language.
Mm-hmm.
And excuse me, I see that in terms of Appendix A, like I said, there were a number of different questions pertaining to this. So Appendix A is essentially a WIOA program services. Think about like as a cheat sheet. And so this is something that we will be posting to our procurement website as a separate link, as a downloaded form, to be able to give you a clearer understanding as to the program elements for WIOA specific programs. That includes like supportive services, individualized career services, So you can use that as a guide to be able to assist and ensure that your program is obviously aligned to some of the program elements specified as part of WIOA. So that will be included and linked on the procurement page. Try to do that obviously like later. This should have been up like weeks ago, but I'll try to ensure that that's linked up there this afternoon. For the fillable submission form, is it expected that the answers are scrollable? Small purple area to change your text. So it can, so in that situation, it will probably be best to attach, to have an attachment with your full response if it is getting chopped off in the submission form box. Yes, there is a scrollable feature, but if you turn into a PDF, it may not show all of the text. But in those cases, it may be better just for those specific answers to include like a separate attachment specifically for those open-ended questions. And yeah, so clarification on the exclusion of on-the-job training reference and on page 3 of your RFP. So yeah, I will follow up in the FAQ document with more explanation for that. I just need to go back into that specific page of your RFP to make sure I'm clear in terms of what that exact language is, but I'll follow up in terms of the FAQ and on the FAQ document with more clarification on that point.
I've just got a quick question about the reimbursement schedule.
Mhm.
So if you, so the first month will essentially be August. So we spend what we spend in August and we submit a report for reimbursement sometime in September. What's the soonest we could hope to receive a check or an ACH or whatever it is to pay us back for August?
So invoices are due on the 5th of every month. And our finance team has a 10-day turnaround time for maximum 10-day turnaround time for processing. And if there are no revisions or if there are no questions as it pertains to the invoice, then you can expect a turnaround time of 10 days from the submission of your invoice. But obviously that can be delayed if there are costs that are included as part of your invoice that weren't in the budget or we need further information.
Thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? All right. I'm going to stop the recording now, but thank you everyone for obviously just being able to join us here. I'm really excited again for this opportunity. Really excited obviously to be able to get the submissions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email workforceoperationsrp@PhilaWorks.org. You can also email me directly if you have any questions as well. Like I said, if there are any questions that I did not address, they will be included in the FAQ document that will be available on the 21st. And then we will include the Appendix A on the procurement website, this week. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great day. All right, take care.